Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as manufacturing and engineering. We offer 3 different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the FDAgroup.com, check us out, and get in touch. So today I am speaking with Christine Bump. So Christine, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you, Nick. I am really happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we jump into the topic for today, would you mind just kind of introducing yourself and your background?
Of course. So I currently run a solo legal practice, Penn Avenue Law and Policy, which is FDA focused on devices, digital health, software as a medical device, diagnostics. I've actually been a food and drug attorney since 2004. And I had the great fortune of starting my career at a food and drug boutique firm. So I got to really see how nuanced each area of food and drug law is, because you had partners that were solely specializing in one narrow area. I went from there to big law, where I got a broader experience. And one of the reasons I started my own firm was because I really wanted to work with startups that can't necessarily pay big law rates. So I'm really enjoying working with companies that are just trying to break into the market with their great ideas.
Well, when smaller firms enter what I call FDA land, it's a brand new experience, right?
It is. Yes.
And so kind of the very first thing that people should do once they enter this territory is understand the regulatory landscape and start developing a regulatory strategy. So can you kind of begin and talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. So a regulatory strategy it's an internal document. It's not anything that you ever show to FDA. It's an internal document that is really a master roadmap of how a company can get their product to market. And it is beneficial to lay out all of the possible elements, all of the possible variations at the beginning, so that you don't have any surprises. So the very first element of a regulatory strategy is is actually defining what your product is going to do. And I'm going to speak in terms of devices, since that's really my main practice area and it's easy to give examples. So in a device submission to FDA, one of your first things you have to declare is your indications for use. That's a literal statement about what your device does, and that's the disease or condition that it's intended to treat, alleviate, or diagnose. What the patient population is your patient population all adults? Is it only women? Is it only people who have already been diagnosed or treated for a disease? And then how you just intend it to be used in the marketplace. So you have to really define up front, in order to have all the other pieces fall into place, what your device is and who it's for. Then the next step after that is actually to put together the potential claims you want to make about your product, what you want to be able to say about it, and how you're going to advertise it. A lot of companies think this is really premature to put up front, but the reality is that especially for devices, the type of claims you want to make about your product can actually determine what class you're in. So you could have the same exact product, where if you want to make full-on claims that we can diagnose this disease, that's class 3. But if you say, well, I don't really want to be a class 3 device, I don't want to go through all that, what that entails, and you have data and can find a predicate that you share substantial equivalence with, that you can just say, well, we aid in detecting this disorder, and we're supposed to be a tool used with all the other tools at a doctor's disposal, then you're going to be class 2. So that's a business decision that companies really need to make up front. So then you put together your intended use and your claims, and you can figure out your regulatory classification. And then that regulatory classification is going to lay out for you what your regulatory pathway is. Are you a class 2 device that is appropriate for a 510K? If so, can you identify your predicate? If you're a high risk device or a new and novel device and you don't have a predicate, are you going to need a PMA, a pre-market approval application? Or are you only in class 3 because you're new and novel, and therefore you're going to want to bump down to something called a Denovo? Your regulatory plan can lay that all out. And then once you see that, you can lay out up front all of the tests from performance testing, biocompatibility testing, bench testing you're going to need. And then also if you're going to need any clinical data. And you can then map out up front before you even submit anything to FDA, how much time that's going to take and maybe how much that's going to cost. And especially for smaller companies, that can be like a big light bulb moment of whether they need more capital, because they could think, oh, I can just fill out these application forms, get to FDA, but then they realize, no, we need to take a step back and get a whole lot more money in order to get the data we need. So it's I said, it's like one big roadmap at the very beginning that lays out everything and hopefully prevents a lot of surprises.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things I think would be interesting to talk about is, can you help define for the audience what the different classes are?
Sure.
What they mean. And then also when we talk about the differences of 510Ks, Denovos, and PMAs, one of the things you said is it can be a light bulb moment. I've seen those light bulb moments. They're generally not good.
Right.
So in addition to, after you talk about the classes of medical devices and you kind of talk about the differences with 510Ks, Denovos, and PMAs, just throw out some generalized figures in terms of what people can expect in terms of the amount of capital they would need in order to complete that regulatory submission, and what does the timeline look like?
Sure. Yeah. So again, in the device space, so there's 3 classifications: class 1, 2, and 3. Class 1 are low risk devices that generally do not have to have any type of pre-market authorization from FDA. So you can go to market without putting anything about your product itself before FDA. Now, that said, you still have to have proof on you still have to have proof yourself that you are complying with
Oh, hold on one second.
Yeah.
I should have thought of my phone going off in the middle of the podcast. All right, I'm
No, I know.
sorry about
I
that.
think I turned everything off, but
That was me. So go ahead, continue.
yeah, so you still have to have proof that you're complying with FDA's quality requirements, and you have to register your facility, and it can be inspected by FDA. But your product itself does not have to go before the FDA. So like the classic example of a class 1 device is a bandage, just a plain bandage that is used to cover a cut or a wound. Class 2 are devices that are moderate risk. So if we take our Band-Aid example, if you then take your Band-Aid and you coat it with an antimicrobial drug or solution that then is treating the cut to help it heal faster, your class 1 device became a class 2 device. And class 2 devices go through something called a 510K pre-notification process. 510K is just like the section of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that's what it is. So a 510K, the way I describe it to clients is you don't have to prove to FDA in a vacuum that you are safe and effective for the market. You just have to show that you are as safe and as effective as something else that's already on the market. So that's why part of the 510K process is identifying a predicate. You search, FDA has all these databases, and you search for a device that's similar to yours. Does it have the same intended use? Does it have the same patient population? Do you have similar data? And you just have to show that you're as safe and as effective as that. Now, a 510K, FDA has a statutory requirement to review 510Ks in 90 days. So people think that means from the day you submit your 510K application, you're going to know in 90 days whether you can go on the market. That's not exactly how it works, because FDA can stop the clock every time they have a question. So if they get your submission and they have questions, they send you in writing something called a request for additional information, and that literally stops the clock, and the clock doesn't start until you respond. And sometimes the responses take companies months. The responses can actually be gathering new data or rerunning your data or performing a meta-analysis to give the FDA a better idea of your data. So your 90 days can lengthen. And I think right now the average time for a PMA, excuse me, a 510K is 5 to 6 months. And that's not only, and then you have the cost. So to submit your 510K submission, just for the privilege of having FDA review it, it's over, I didn't look up the exact numbers, but it's over $5,000.
Yeah, it changes every year.
It changes every year.
Yeah, it goes up like a few $100 every year.
Yeah, so it's over $5,000 to just have them review it, and that doesn't even include whatever money you had to spend to gather data, product development, if you had a lawyer or a consultant do your regulatory strategy, prepare your submission. None of those costs are included in that. A PMA is the device equivalent of like a full-on drug approval. So you cannot compare your device to another one. That's that vacuum situation. You have to prove to FDA in a vacuum that your device is safe and effective to be on the market. And so these are high-risk devices, or devices that are simply new or novel. Like, so you have a brand new technology that might not be high risk, but you can't find a predicate to compare yourself to get into the 510K world, because you're just so revolutionary. So a PMA, as I said, your most PMAs are going to need full-on clinical data. So you have all that time and money invested up front, and sometimes that can take companies years. Once you submit your PMA to FDA, statutorily, they have 6 months, 180 days to review it. I would say that I don't know the exact average for PMAs, but I would definitely say you have to count on a year or more. I have worked on some outliers where a PMA has taken 3 years and one PMA has taken 6. In the case of the 6-year PMA, it was a very controversial product with a lot of political considerations. So that clock was stopped over and over and over again through, no fault of the company. And then, so you can, companies can spend a really small fortune on that clinical data that's required. And when you submit it to FDA, I mean, it's in the 6 figures, like 6-figure application fee.
Yeah.
So now
what about Denovos?
Yeah, I was gonna say there is something called Denovos. So that bucket of new and novel devices that you're only class 3 because you can't compare yourself to something else, but you shouldn't be in class 3. There's a process called Denovo, which is sort of like it's sort of like this middle ground between PMA and 510K. So it used to be that you had to submit a PMA to the agent, or a 510K to the agency, and have them say you're not substantially equivalent to anything else, do a Denovo. But that's changed, and you can just do a direct Denovo. You can just go right to FDA with a Denovo, no other prior application, and say, we know that we're not substantially equivalent to anything else, we're new, but we are not high risk. So that Denovo is that in between. And so it's like a 510K without a predicate. It doesn't rise to any of the demands of a PMA, but FDA will develop with you this thing called special controls. So they're saying like, okay, we can't compare you to a predicate. So we don't really have, and you haven't done all the clinical data for a PMA. So we need some assurance that you are going to, that you are safe and effective. So they develop these special controls, which are basically just, really specific quality controls for your type of device. And then once you have the Denovo and you have these special controls for your device, someone else can then file a 510K and compare themselves to you. So that's how that works.
Yeah. And then one of the big questions that people always ask is, how much capital do I need to go through a process like this? So if we're going to think about 510Ks and Denovos, if you were to say to somebody, you probably don't want to start this process until you have X amount of capital, how would you define that?
Well, PMA, I mean, I hate to say it, but you're in the millions
Right?
because of all of the time and money to perform clinical studies. And I've had companies say, well, I have this connection with this lab and we can do this study for cheaper, but that when you submit data to FDA, you actually have to comply with their data requirements. So depending on the type of test and the type of product, they have endpoint requirements. They have biocompatibility requirements. So you can't just say, oh, I can show this. You have to show it FDA's way. And I've had a lot of, especially startup people who themselves are scientists. They're doctors, they're tech people, they're scientists, and they have this great idea. And they're like, but my science is great. I'm like, yeah, your science is great, but it's not regulatory science. There's a whole other set of rules for regulatory science. So I hate to tell people this, but yeah, you really need in the millions. Now for a 510K, as I said, you're going to count on over 5,000 for the application fee. You have to register your facility. That's more than 3,000 a year. If you're going to have, which is a very good idea, to have a consultant or attorney prepare your regulatory strategy and your actual submission. I mean, that can be $25,000, $35,000, $50,000 or more. And so, I mean, you definitely need 6 figures. And then just depending if you have to do data yourself as well. And it's probably not clinical data, but bench testing, maybe some animal testing. So you could, mid to high 6 figures.
Yeah. And I think that's a good estimate. Mm-hmm. I was listening to you talking about, well, I've done some studies and all that kind of stuff. And for anybody out there that is thinking about coming to market with a medical device, they've got an idea, and they don't know exactly when should I start my regulatory strategy versus engineering the device, where design controls come into play, and doing studies that might not be GCP compliant. What advice would you give to somebody that's starting with the idea?
Well, I say it's never too early. I've worked with people that are still at the product concept stage. They don't even have a physical product, but a regulatory strategy can help determine the functionality of it and then what they want to do. So for example, like in the software space, I know you've worked a lot with software as a medical device. Depending on what the functionality of your software product is, you could be a device or you could not be a device. So if depending on if your priority is just getting to market or your priority is to do this special function. So an example is if you have a software that just gathers data and presents it to somebody, like a smartwatch that just monitors their blood pressure, their heart rate while they're exercising, while they're at rest, and just literally gives them those numbers for their monitoring, then you probably don't have to do anything with FDA in terms of a submission. But if you take that information and you start giving them health advice and saying, hey, you might have heart disease, you need to go to a cardiologist, or you have tipped this point into obesity. FDA now considers that to be a diagnosis of cardiovascular disorder or obesity. And so you are a device that has to go through the FDA regulatory process. So I've worked with software companies that come to me actually when they don't even know what their software is going to do yet. It's just that initial product concept, and we can use the regulatory strategy to determine exactly what their functionality of their software should be in order to meet their regulatory and business goals. But I've worked with other companies where it's all along the process. They actually have their device. They may or may not have data. I would say it's never too early, but it's also never too late, because you definitely should have a regulatory strategy before you go into FDA. You want to have this roadmap of anticipate, like if you have the roadmap of everything laid out, then you can anticipate what FDA would need. So
yeah,
I think that's the question.
It definitely answers the question, and I subscribe to that same answer. I think a lot of times people want to get to a certain destination before they engage, and unfortunately, both of us have seen some of the wasted time, effort, and money. that goes into that these people experience because they weren't aware of how do they design their study and what are the different requirements in order to make sure that they can actually use that data in a submission. So
Exactly.
yeah, I think that's really big. You started to go down the path about software as a medical device, and I can say for the past 2-3 years, that has been the majority of the 510Ks that we've seen. So it's definitely an exploding market. For anybody out there that has a software as a medical device, can you speak a little bit to some of the nuances or aspects of it that are unique that they really need to take into consideration as they move down this path?
Yeah, I would say the first one, as I said, is the functionality. There's FDA's tried to draw this line in the sand between just like gathering, organizing, and presenting information versus doing something with that information. And when you cross that line into doing something with that information, which is generally that those are the buckets that actually provide more use to the user. The most basic and classic example from FDA is the software in the smartwatch. So if I'm just looking at my numbers, I'm like, okay, but if I get an alert that I need to see my doctor, I'm going to, scream from the rooftops as a customer that this is a great product. This really helped me. This prevented me from having a medical event in the future. But that's where then FDA gets really nervous. And that's where you cross that line into needing clearance or approval. And then the other wrinkle in this space is that everything is so new. So software, algorithms, AI, it is exploding. It is growing at like a rate unprecedented. And there's so many uses for consumers' health. So you have not only the concerns about how is FDA going to see our functionality, but then like, are we too new? Are we too novel? Can we compare ourselves to anyone else? And FDA has also wrestled with the fact that their device paradigm doesn't really fit software that can evolve and change. If I take 510Ks, for example, as you know, and some of your users, some of your listeners might know, so the FDA's device framework is actually from the device amendments that amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1976. So they've promulgated different regulations since 1976, but that basic class 1, class 2, class 3 device framework is older than me. And in FDA's regulations, if for 510K, there's and PMA, when you go through that process, that they're clearing or approving your device as it stands. There's a lot of times where if you make a change or a modification for your device, you actually have to go back into FDA. You might need a supplement, you might need an amendment, you might have to get an entirely new 510K or an entirely new approval because you've made these changes. Software changes by the minute. Like it really can change by the minute. So FDA's coming up with a lot more, if a clearance or approval that is a lot more specific to that one product or product category. And they've experimented over the last 10 years with different regulatory pathways for these things, and all of them actually need acts of Congress to put into place. So they're kind of stuck with their device paradigm, but they're when you go in with software, you're going to have a lot more flexibility with FDA, and it's going to be a lot more interactive than if you're going in with a artificial knee.
Yeah. We talked about 510Ks, Denovos, PMAs. One thing we didn't touch on that I'd really like you to speak on is I think a lot of our listeners have heard of pre-submission meetings.
Yes.
So can you explain what that is? Is it a requirement? What are the benefits to it, etc.? What the cost is that goes to FDA or lack thereof?
Lack thereof, yeah. I love pre-submissions. I am really a proponent of pre-submissions, and for any one of my client that has the slightest question is if FDA is going to agree with us, I say we need to do a pre-sub. So a pre-sub is literally a free extra bite at the apple. So And it's free. There's no charge from FDA, unlike any other submission to FDA. There is no charge for a pre-submission. Now, if you have a lawyer or consultant prepare it, you're going to pay us to prepare it. But a pre-submission is kind of like it's a mini submission before you're ready to go in, hence pre. And so you lay out to FDA, this is what we have. This is like what our device is. This is how we would like to describe it. This is how we want to claim what it does. These are the predicates we think fit, or we actually can't find any predicates. Do you have any recommendations? And then you give not in the same detail as a submission, but a really high overview of the data that you have. And it's why I say it's a bite at the apple is it's your opportunity to ask FDA questions. So you're putting this in front of them, but for everything you put in front of them, like your intended use, your claims, your data, whether this predicate is correct, you then have to ask them a question like, do you agree? Or do you think we need more? And FDA is statutorily obligated to answer those questions, but they're not binding. So they're not binding. You can't rely on if they say in your pre-submission, you know, your data is fine. And then you go and you submit you actually submit a 510K and someone says, oh, wait, this data wasn't fine. You can't hold that against the agency because it's a non-binding response. But I've never been in a situation where there's been a major change of mind by FDA that's made a pre-submission not worth it. It's actually just the opposite, where because I talked about that time frame that FDA can stop the clock and ask questions. By doing a pre-submission, you can prevent or really mitigate that from happening. So if you ask your questions up front to the agency, do you agree with this predicate? Then when you submit, you're going to be submitting with a predicate that you're pretty sure they're going to agree with. They're not going to stop the clock and say, hey, we don't like your predicate. This doesn't fit. Same with data. I've only experienced it in a positive way where it's shortened the clock, it's shortened the interactions in between. You get all of that information up front, and it doesn't count against you when you submit and actually start paying the agency.
Yeah. And so you kind of took my next question away from me, which is good. Which is, you know, a lot of people might ask, why waste my time? And really the answer is the pre-sub helps prevent time from being lost. So it's definitely a good investment. My opinion is I don't think pre-subs are always necessary. Some of these devices via 510K are slam dunks. But to your point earlier, if there's any questions, that's really a good opportunity to get in front of the FDA and even beyond that, prove that you know what you're doing, because there is a level of confidence that the FDA is looking for, that these people understand what they're doing, because a lack of confidence means that they're going to have more questions. More questions means more time and money and a delay to market.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another thing I think that would be useful for the audience is, you know, what other than what we've already discussed today, are there any other pitfalls that you think people should be aware of when they start this journey?
I would say the pitfalls are really like not knowing what you don't know. So that comes into play as we talked about data, that, you know, good science isn't necessarily regulatory science. The money, people might not have a big enough budget. They might not have a deep enough bench within the company. So when you do a full-on regulatory strategy at the outset, you can see you know, the whole roadmap, and that can indicate to you, well, we don't have any employees that actually can do that. So what do we do with that? Do we go out and hire more people, or do we use something like the FDA group and get some full-time equivalents, some consultants to help us? So I would say that what I see a lot is I personally feel like I've never worked with a bad actor. I feel like all these companies that I've had the privilege to work with are very good companies, and they're all very bright people. But if you're new to this space, it's just things you don't know you're supposed to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of the questions I've been asking you, I kind of already knew the answers to. However, I do have another question for you, and I don't know the answer to this. So, for people that are, again, they've got the idea, they're kind of ready to get engaged, and they hear you're an attorney, and then there's also consulting firms. How would you define the similarities between an attorney and a consulting firm? Also, what would you say are some of the differences?
Okay. And so a regulatory attorney and a regulatory consultant, I do think share the same knowledge base, share the same experience in going through FDA, but what we bring different things to the table. So I have and I can, for example, prepare an actual 510K, prepare a PMA, but usually a lawyer model is a lot more costly and less efficient than a consultant. So I have clients for whom I actually do those applications, but I think it's a good idea for attorneys to refer the 510K, the PMA, refer that to a consulting firm. They have a different billing model, they have a different cost model, and it's usually more hands-on deck than an attorney to fill in all the various pieces and sections of a submission. What I think an attorney can bring to the table is at the outset in really thinking high level about strategy and the nuances of the law. So if I think doing that, you can do a regulatory strategy with an attorney or a consultant. And I've honestly over my career only had positive experience with consultants. I took a short break from law and was a consultant myself and just kept my legal license valid and came back to it. But I think as an attorney with an attorney hat on, you're looking more at the law, you're looking more at the details of the regulations, the nuances, and you can better issue spot for clients. But with a good consulting firm or a good regulatory attorney, I don't think a client can go wrong.
Yeah, great. So as we wrap things up, I have two final questions for you. One is there anything else that you'd like to add and share with the audience? And then secondly, for anybody that's interested in how they can get in contact with you, can you share how they can get in contact with you?
Sure. So in the anything else category, I would say that, that a company can never plan too far in advance. And also there's a lot of times where a company's business and strategic goals from an operational standpoint are very different from what it turns out they actually want to do from a regulatory standpoint. So I have a couple of examples. I'll just go over quickly with that. So like let's say outside of the device space, in the wellness and cosmetic space, there's the same exact product can be a wellness product or a cosmetic or a drug, depending on what claims the person wants to make. So a small company could have this topical cream that they know is an analgesic and it treats and relieves pain. But they might start out by saying, I have this great pain relief cream. I want to go to the market making all of these pain claims. Well, if you do that, you're a drug. And you have to, even if you're OTC, there's a lot of very strict monograph requirements. You can only have certain ingredients. You can't have other ingredients. Your ingredients can only be in a certain amount. You have to register as a drug facility. You have to produce it under all the drug GMPs and quality controls. And, they might say, well, wait, no, I literally can't afford any of that. So your operational goal of shouting from the rooftop that you treat pain might dial you back to starting out as a cosmetic, making no claims at all, just putting your wonderful cream on the market without making any claims. And you can generate your revenue stream that way and consider down the road if you want to switch over into the OTC drug space. Happens also a lot with algorithms. So in software as a medical device, like there can be an algorithm that's meant to enhance like a radiographic image. And that algorithm, the could actually, identify an area of concern for a radiologist. But to do that, the amount of time, the amount of money, that might not, it might originally have been the company's goal to like go blazing into the market with this wonderful claim, but they have to dial it back until they have the revenue for that. And the revenue can come from going into FDA as a 510K and saying, well, we aid in detecting this, and our algorithm can't be relied upon to make a diagnosis. And then you get on the market and you generate revenue, and then you can move forward and make those claims you want to make. So I would say a lot of times, like, an operational business goal of the company doesn't align with what they can actually do at first from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah. So I'm gonna comment on that, and then I'm gonna go to my second question. I like to say that FDA talks in backwards riddles.
Yeah.
So and it's completely it's logical, but oftentimes anybody can go on FDA's website, look up warning letters, and you'll see a plethora of people selling unapproved new drugs. And in reality, these people are not selling drugs; they're making medical claims, which they can't do. Right. Yeah. And so it's not as if they're mad scientists in the lab creating these chemicals and then sending it out to the unsuspecting public. It's I have a nutraceutical, I have a cosmetic, I have a dietary supplement, but I just went a little too far with what it can do from a benefit purpose, and those are controlled by FDA regulations.
And I'll also say I've been in FDA meetings with clients, and like they literally write down verbatim what FDA said, and I write down verbatim what FDA said, and they think FDA said something completely different than what I know they said.
Yeah.
It's this regulatory speak, and it can be backwards.
Yeah. And then to your kind of your overall idea, I would say is that a lot of these people they don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. And so definitely getting some help very early on, even when you think it's too soon, it's not going to break the bank, and it will really allow you to better understand what the landscape is and what to plan for. So so let me go back to my final question before we close out. If people want to find you, where can they find you?
So I'm Christine Bump, middle initial P as in Peter, and I'm on LinkedIn. My firm is called Penn Avenue Law and Policy, and the website is pennavenuelaw.com.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Christine, this was awesome. I really appreciate it. And to everybody else, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast, and follow the FDA group on LinkedIn. Or you can feel free to get in contact with me personally. Just send me an invite or a message. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.